I stared at the bright red rejection letter in my hand, my coffee going cold on the kitchen counter, wondering how in the hell the Riverside Meadows HOA could deny my request to install solar panels using a rule that specifically mentioned satellite dishes over 18 inches in diameter. The absurdity of it hit me like a freight train, and I knew right then that this was going to be one hell of a fight. My name is Ingram, and I had moved to this supposedly peaceful neighborhood in Henderson, Nevada, about 8 months ago. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom ranch-style property with a spacious backyard and enough sun exposure to make solar panels not just feasible but actually a smart financial decision. I had done my research, checked the covenants, conditions, and restrictions document 3 times, and nowhere did it say anything prohibiting solar panels. In fact, Nevada state law actually protected homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems. But apparently, the Riverside Meadows HOA president, a woman named Barbara Whitfield, had other ideas. I grabbed my phone and dialed my neighbor Mike's number. He had been living here for 6 years and had warned me about Barbara when I first moved in, but I had brushed it off as typical neighborhood gossip. Now, I was starting to think he had been understating the problem. "Mike, you are not going to believe this," I said when he picked up. "Let me guess, Barbara rejected something." His voice carried that knowing tone that said he had been through this before. "She rejected my solar panel application using a rule about satellite dishes." "Satellite dishes, Mike." "I am trying to install solar panels, not put up a giant dish to contact aliens." Mike let out a long, tired laugh. "Welcome to the club, man. She denied my request to repaint my front door using a rule about livestock." Livestock. I wanted to change my door from beige to navy blue, and she cited the section about not keeping farm animals on the property. "You are kidding me." I wish I was. "Listen, a bunch of us have been dealing with this for years. Barbara basically runs the HOA like her personal fiefdom. The board is supposed to have 5 members, but 2 positions have been vacant for over a year, and the other 2 members are her sister Deanne and her friend Cheryl. They rubber stamp everything she wants." I felt my jaw tighten. "That cannot be legal." "Probably not, but nobody has had the time or money to really fight it. Most people just give up or move away. The turnover rate in this neighborhood is ridiculous." After hanging up with Mike, I pulled out the entire HOA documentation packet that had been given to me at closing. The thing was a beast. Over 200 pages of rules, regulations, bylaws, and amendments. I made a fresh pot of coffee and settled in at my dining room table, determined to find out exactly what I was dealing with. 3 hours later, my eyes were burning, but I had found something interesting. The rule Barbara had cited in her rejection letter was Section 7.3, Paragraph B, which stated, "No homeowner shall install, erect, or maintain satellite dishes exceeding 18 inches in diameter on any visible exterior portion of their property without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." The problem was, I had also found Section 12.5, which had been added in an amendment from 2019. It clearly stated, "In accordance with Nevada Revised Statutes 116.2113, the association shall not prohibit the installation of solar energy systems on individual lots. Any restrictions must be reasonable and may only address placement and manner of installation to protect aesthetic concerns while not significantly increasing the cost or decreasing the efficiency of the system." I also discovered that my property had an additional quirk. According to the original subdivision plat from 1998, my lot, along with 4 others on my street, had been designated as Phase 2 development, which was subject to a separate set of architectural guidelines. Those guidelines made no mention of satellite dish restrictions at all. In fact, the Phase 2 properties had explicitly more relaxed rules to encourage faster sales when the development was initially struggling. Armed with this information, I drafted a careful email to Barbara Whitfield, citing the specific sections I had found and requesting a meeting to discuss the denial. I kept my tone professional and factual, even though what I really wanted to do was point out how utterly ridiculous it was to confuse solar panels with satellite dishes. Her response came less than 20 minutes later, which surprised me. What did not surprise me was the content. Mr. Ingram, your request has been properly denied in accordance with our community standards. The Architectural Review Committee has full discretion over all external modifications to properties within Riverside Meadows. Your appeal is noted but will not change the decision. Any further installations without approval will result in daily fines of $200. Regards, Barbara Whitfield, HOA President. No mention of the specific statutes I had cited. No acknowledgement of the Phase 2 designation, just a blanket assertion of power and a threat of fines. I called my real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison who had handled my home closing. She listened to my explanation, asked me to send her all the documentation, and told me she would get back to me within 48 hours. Ethan, based on what you are telling me, this sounds like a clear case of overreach, Patricia said. But I want to review everything before we proceed. HOA disputes can get messy, and I want to make sure we have all our ducks in a row. While I waited for Patricia to do her analysis, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I went door to door on my street, talking to neighbors about their experiences with the HOA. What I discovered was even worse than I had imagined. 3 houses down, an elderly couple named Robert and Susan Chen told me they had been fined $15,000 over 2 years for having the wrong shade of beige on their garage door. The HOA had approved their paint sample, but when they completed the work, Barbara claimed it did not match and had been imposing fines ever since. Across the street, a single mother named Jennifer Walsh was being fined for having a crack in her driveway that was less than a quarter-inch wide. She had gotten 3 quotes for repair, and the cheapest was $8,000 because they would have to replace the entire driveway to match the existing concrete age and color. Meanwhile, Barbara herself had visible cracks in her driveway that went unmentioned. 2 doors down from Jennifer, a young couple named David and Emma Richardson had been denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp for Emma's father who was moving in with them. The denial reason: ramps are not architecturally consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. Never mind that denying a wheelchair ramp was almost certainly a violation of federal fair housing laws. By the time I finished my informal survey, I had documented 12 separate cases of what appeared to be either arbitrary enforcement or outright violations of state and federal law. I took detailed notes, collected copies of denial letters and fine notices, and started building a case file. Patricia called me back 2 days later, and I could hear the anger in her usually calm voice. Ethan, this is one of the worst cases of HOA abuse I have seen in 15 years of practice. Barbara Whitfield is not just overstepping, she is potentially committing fraud and extortion. I found some very interesting things when I pulled the HOA's financial records from the county. What kind of things? The kind that suggest she has been funneling HOA funds into personal accounts. The association has been collecting dues from all 147 homes in the development for the past 5 years. That is roughly $360,000 annually, based on the current dues structure. but the actual expenditures recorded are less than half that. And get this, the HOA has been contracting with a property management company called Whitfield Property Services for landscaping and maintenance. Let me guess, owned by Barbara, owned by her husband, Gerald Whitfield. And the amounts being paid are about 3 times the market rate for similar services. I called around and got quotes from other companies. What the HOA is paying them annually, I could get the same services for about 1/3 of the cost. I felt my stomach turn. So she is basically stealing from everyone in the neighborhood. That is exactly what she is doing. And the denial of your solar panels, I think that is part of a pattern. She has been denying improvement requests and imposing fines to create a hostile environment that drives property values down. 3 houses on your street alone have sold in the past year at significant losses compared to comparable homes in adjacent neighborhoods. I think she might be buying them through shell companies. That is insane. Why would she want to drive down property values? Control, mostly. But also, if she can buy up properties cheap, she can eventually control enough votes to do whatever she wants with the HOA, including potentially dissolving it and redeveloping the land. This area is prime real estate. A developer could buy up the whole neighborhood, tear it down, and put in high-density housing or commercial property. We are talking tens of millions in potential profit. The scope of what Patricia was describing made my head spin. This was not just a petty tyrant on a power trip. This was organized, calculated fraud on a massive scale. What do we do? I asked. First, we file a formal appeal with the HOA board, following every procedural requirement to the letter. We document everything. Second, I am going to contact some of your neighbors and see if they want to join a class action suit. Third, and this is the big one, I am going to refer this case to the Nevada Attorney General's office and the FBI. If what I suspect is happening is actually happening, this is wire fraud, mail fraud, and potentially RICO violations. RICO, like the mob. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is not just for the mafia anymore. It is used for any ongoing criminal enterprise, and systematically defrauding homeowners through an HOA absolutely qualifies. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved fast. Patricia filed my formal appeal, and we requested a hearing before the full HOA board, as was my right under Nevada law. Barbara tried to deny the hearing request, but Patricia threatened immediate legal action and she backed down. Meanwhile, Patricia had been meeting with my neighbors. 14 households agreed to join the class action lawsuit. More importantly, several of them provided financial records, emails, and other documentation that painted an even clearer picture of Barbara's schemes. The HOA board hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at 7 in the community clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early with Patricia, and we were both surprised to see the parking lot nearly full. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and it seemed like half the residents had shown up. Barbara was already there, sitting at a table at the front of the room with her sister Deanne and her friend Cheryl. All 3 women looked tense when they saw the crowd. Barbara was exactly what you would expect from her behavior. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in that aggressive soccer mom style, wearing an expensive-looking pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. "This is a closed board meeting," Barbara announced loudly as people filed in. "Only residents with pending appeals are allowed to attend." Patricia stood up smoothly. "Actually, Mrs. Whitfield, under Nevada Revised Statutes 116.31083, all HOA board meetings must be open to all members of the association, unless they are discussing personnel matters or consulting with the association's attorney. Since this is a hearing on an architectural appeal, it absolutely must be open to all members. Would you like me to cite the specific statute again, or would you prefer to let people stay? Barbara's face went red, but she waved her hand dismissively. Fine. Everyone can stay. But we are not going to tolerate disruptions. The hearing started with Barbara reading her denial letter aloud, adding her own editorial comments about how my proposed solar panels would be an eyesore that would destroy property values and the character of our beautiful community. When she finished, Patricia stood and handed out packets to the 3 board members. Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Foster, Mrs. Chen, you will find in these packets several key pieces of information. First, the Nevada revised statute that explicitly prevents HOA restrictions on solar energy systems. Second, the specific section of the Riverside Meadows CC&R amendments from 2019 that incorporated that statute. Third, the original Phase 2 architectural guidelines that apply to Mr. Ingram's property, which do not include any restrictions on solar installations. And fourth, documentation that the rule you cited in your denial, Section 7.3 Paragraph B regarding satellite dishes, has absolutely no relevance to solar panels. Barbara barely glanced at the packet. The board has full discretion over architectural decisions. That is clearly stated in our governing documents. Discretion, yes, but not unlimited discretion. Your authority is constrained by state and federal law. You cannot, for instance, prohibit wheelchair ramps even though you try to do exactly that to the Richardson family. You cannot selectively enforce rules, such as fining the Chen family for their garage door color while ignoring identical or worse violations on your own property. And you absolutely cannot cite inapplicable rules to deny valid requests. I do not appreciate your tone, Barbara snapped. This board has been faithfully serving this community for years. We have maintained property values and kept this neighborhood beautiful. Have you? Patricia pulled out another document. Because I have the sales records from the past 3 years. Properties in Riverside Meadows are selling for an average of 18% less than comparable properties in the surrounding area. That is a direct result of your administration's hostile and arbitrary enforcement policies. Deanne, Barbara's sister, finally spoke up. She was quieter than Barbara, but her voice had a nasty edge. Maybe those properties sold for less because the owners did not maintain them properly. That is not our fault. Actually, several of those owners were being fined into bankruptcy by this board for minor violations, while actual maintenance issues on board members' properties went unaddressed. I have photographs if you would like to see them. The crowd behind us was starting to murmur. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. Barbara stood up abruptly. This hearing is over. The denial stands. If you want to challenge it, take us to court. We will, Patricia said calmly. But before we go, I want to make you aware that I have referred this matter to the Nevada Attorney General's office. They are very interested in the financial arrangements between the Riverside Meadows HOA and Whitfield Property Services. They are also interested in property purchases made by Sage Desert Holdings LLC over the past 2 years. That is your shell company, is it not, Mrs. Whitfield? The room went absolutely silent. Barbara's face drained of color, then flushed bright red. I do not know what you are talking about, she said, but her voice shook. I think you do. I think you have been systematically defrauding the homeowners of this community, using HOA funds to overpay your husband's company, denying reasonable requests, and imposing excessive fines to drive down property values, then buying up properties through your shell company at depressed prices. And I think when the Attorney General's office finishes their investigation, they are going to find evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, and potentially RICO violations. Cheryl, the third board member, stood up suddenly. I did not know about any of this. Barbara, what is she talking about? Shut up, Cheryl, Barbara hissed. But it was too late. The dam had broken. People in the crowd started shouting questions. Mike, my neighbor, stood up and yelled, "Is it true? Have you been stealing from us?" The meeting dissolved into chaos. Barbara grabbed her purse and tried to leave, but a tall man I recognized as Robert Chen, the elderly man being fined for his garage door, blocked her path. "You owe my family $15,000, he said quietly. $15,000 for a garage door that you approved, then decided you did not like. Do you have any idea what that money meant to us? My wife needs surgery. We have been putting it off because of your fines." Barbara tried to push past him, but Patricia's voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Whitfield, I would strongly suggest you stay. The Attorney General's office is going to want to interview you, and leaving right now is only going to make you look more guilty." Over the next hour, the meeting turned into an impromptu community forum. One by one, residents stood up and shared their experiences with Barbara's HOA reign of terror. The stories were heartbreaking. A veteran who had been denied permission to fly an American flag. A teacher who had been fined for parking her sensible sedan in her own driveway because it was not luxury enough for the neighborhood standards. A retired couple who had been cited for having brown spots in their lawn during a drought when watering restrictions were in place. Through it all, Barbara sat in stony silence while Deanne and Cheryl looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Cheryl spoke up again. "I am resigning from the board, effective immediately," she announced. "I thought I was helping the neighborhood. I trusted Barbara's judgment on these matters. But if even half of what I am hearing tonight is true, I want no part of this." Deanne was silent for a long moment, then she too stood. "I am also resigning. Barbara, you are my sister, but this is wrong. All of it." Barbara finally seemed to realize how badly things had turned against her. "You are all going to regret this," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I built this community. I made it what it is. And you are going to destroy it because you are too cheap and lazy to maintain proper standards." "You did not build anything," Mike called out. "You terrorized people and stole their money. There is a difference." Barbara left then, pushing her way through the crowd and out the door. The meeting continued for another hour as Patricia explained the legal process going forward and collected more information from residents who wanted to join the lawsuit. When I finally got home that night, I was exhausted but energized. For the first time since I had received that ridiculous rejection letter, I felt like we might actually win this fight. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Patricia filed the class action lawsuit in Nevada District Court, naming Barbara, the HOA board, and Whitfield Property Services as defendants. The complaint was extensive, laying out years of abuse, financial mismanagement, and fraud. More importantly, the Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation. 2 investigators showed up at Barbara's house with a warrant to search for financial records. They also seized records from the HOA's management office and from Whitfield Property Services. I kept my head down during this period, focusing on my work and trying not to obsess over the case. But it was hard not to when nearly every conversation with neighbors turned into discussions about the lawsuit and the investigation. About 6 weeks after the disastrous board meeting, Patricia called me with an update. "The AG's office found what they needed," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Barbara and Gerald Whitfield have been indicted on 15 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The evidence is overwhelming. Bank records showing transfers from the HOA accounts to their personal accounts. Inflated invoices from Whitfield Property Services. Documents showing they own Sage Desert Holdings and have been buying up properties in the neighborhood at below-market rates. The prosecutors think this goes back at least 7 years, maybe longer. How much money are we talking about? Over $2 million in direct theft from HOA accounts. Probably another $3 to $4 million in the property scheme when you account for the difference between what they paid for houses and what those houses would have been worth without the artificial depression of property values. I let out a low whistle. That is serious prison time. It should be. The prosecutors are also going after their assets. They have frozen the Whitfield's bank accounts and put liens on their properties. There is a good chance the homeowners will get at least some restitution. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Barbara and Gerald were arrested 3 months after the initial investigation began. I watched the news coverage showing them being led out of their house in handcuffs, and I would be lying if I said I did not feel a sense of vindication. Their defense attorney tried to argue that the financial arrangements were legitimate business dealings, and that the HOA board had approved all the contracts with Whitfield Property Services. But the prosecution had emails, text messages, and testimony from Cheryl, who had received immunity in exchange for her cooperation. The evidence showed Barbara had falsified board meeting minutes and forged approval documents. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended several days of testimony, watching as the prosecution systematically dismantled Barbara's defense. The moment that stuck with me most was when Robert Chen testified about the impact of the fines on his family. He broke down in tears describing how his wife had delayed her surgery, how they had considered selling their home and moving in with their daughter, how the stress had affected their health and their marriage. Barbara showed no emotion during his testimony. She sat at the defense table with the same rigid, angry expression she had worn at the board meeting. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts for both Barbara and Gerald. The courtroom erupted in applause, which the judge quickly silenced, but the message was clear. Justice had been served. Sentencing came 2 months later. Barbara received 8 years in federal prison. Gerald received 6 years. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and the individual homeowners they had defrauded, though Patricia was realistic about how much we would actually recover. Their assets are substantial, but not enough to cover everything, she explained. You will probably get back 70 to 80% of what was stolen. It is not perfect, but it is better than nothing. The civil lawsuit was settled shortly after the criminal convictions. The HOA's insurance carrier agreed to pay out a significant settlement to cover the damages beyond what could be recovered from the Whitfields personally. Each household in the class action received an average of $25,000, which helped offset the fines, legal fees, and stress of the past year. With Barbara gone, the neighborhood had to rebuild the HOA from scratch. A special election was held, and new board members were chosen. Mike, my neighbor, was elected president. The first order of business was reviewing and revising all the architectural guidelines to make them clear, reasonable, and actually enforceable. The second order of business was approving my solar panel application, which passed unanimously. The board also approved the wheelchair ramp for the Richardsons, a new paint scheme for the Chen's garage door at HOA expense, and a dozen other, previously denied requests that had been perfectly reasonable all along. Installing the solar panels felt surreal. I stood in my backyard on a sunny Saturday morning, watching the installation crew work, and thought about how a simple home improvement project had uncovered years of corruption and abuse. If Barbara had just approved my application, or even denied it using a legitimate reason, none of this would have come to light. Her arrogance and sloppiness had been her downfall. The panels went up without any issues. They looked great, sleek and modern but not obtrusive. And more importantly, my electric bill dropped by about 80%. The system would pay for itself in about 7 years, which was exactly what I had calculated when I first planned the project. Life in Riverside Meadows slowly returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal than it had been under Barbara's regime. Property values started to recover, as word spread that the toxic HOA situation had been resolved. People stopped being afraid to maintain their homes or make reasonable improvements. The neighborhood started to feel like an actual community instead of a police state. I stayed in touch with Patricia, who told me the case had become something of a legend in Nevada legal circles. She had been contacted by homeowners in 3 other states dealing with similar HOA abuse situations, asking for advice on how to fight back. "You started something," she told me. "People are realizing they do not have to just accept HOA tyranny. They have legal rights and they can fight back." About a year after the whole saga began, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard. Mike was there, along with the Chens, the Richardsons, Jennifer Walsh, and about 30 other neighbors. We ate burgers and drank beer and watched the kids play in the pool. Robert Chen raised his glass in a toast to Ethan, who was too stubborn to accept a bogus denial letter. Everyone laughed and cheered, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the Nevada sun beating down on us. "I was just trying to install some solar panels," I said. "I had no idea it would turn into all of this." "That is the thing about standing up to bullies," Mike said. "You never know who else you are helping when you refuse to back down." Emma Richardson, sitting in her wheelchair beside the new ramp that led to their back patio, nodded. "You gave us all permission to fight back. Before this, I think we all felt alone and helpless. You showed us we were not." As the afternoon turned to evening and the party continued, I looked around at the faces of my neighbors and friends. These were good people who had been pushed around and taken advantage of by someone who was supposed to be serving their interests. But they had found their strength, and together we had taken back our community. My solar panels hummed quietly on the roof, converting sunlight into energy, a daily reminder that sometimes the smallest act of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. I had just wanted to lower my electric bill and do something good for the environment. Instead, I had helped bring down a criminal enterprise and freed an entire neighborhood from years of corruption. The legal battles were over. The criminals were in prison. The neighborhood was healing. And I finally had my solar panels, installed completely legally, and with the full approval of a properly functioning HOA board that actually followed the rules. Some people might say I should have just dropped the whole thing when Barbara first rejected my application. Life would certainly have been easier. But standing in my backyard that evening, surrounded by friends and neighbors, I knew I had made the right choice, because it was never really about the solar panels. It was about the principle that rules should mean something, that authority comes with responsibility, and that ordinary people have the power to stand up against corruption when they find the courage to do so. The sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My solar panels caught the last rays of daylight, storing energy for the night ahead. And for the first time since I had moved to Riverside Meadows, I felt completely at home. The following months brought a sense of peace to the neighborhood that had been absent for years. The new HOA board, led by Mike, operated with transparency and common sense. They published financial reports quarterly, held open meetings with actual community input, and focused on genuine maintenance issues rather than petty aesthetic complaints. The Richardson family finally got to bring Emma's father home, and the wheelchair ramp that Barbara had fought so hard against turned out to be barely noticeable, blending seamlessly with the house's architecture. It made me wonder how many other denied requests over the years had been perfectly reasonable, but rejected simply because Barbara enjoyed exercising power over people. The Chen family used part of their settlement money to finally get Susan the surgery she needed. Robert told me one afternoon, while we were both checking our mail, that they had considered leaving Riverside Meadows dozens of times over the years, but had felt trapped. Their house had lost so much value under Barbara's reign that selling would have meant taking a devastating loss. Now, with property values recovering and the settlement money in hand, they were choosing to stay because they actually liked the neighborhood again. Jennifer Walsh, the single mother who had been fined for the tiny crack in her driveway, became one of the new board members. She brought a practical perspective to decisions, always asking whether rules actually served the community's interests or were just arbitrary exercises of control. Under her influence, the board eliminated about 40% of the old regulations, keeping only those that genuinely protected property values and community safety. I learned more details about the criminal case as it wrapped up. The forensic accountants had traced the fraud back 9 years, not 7 as initially thought. Barbara had started small, just padding invoices here and there, but had gotten bolder over time. The scheme with the shell company buying depressed properties had been particularly elaborate. Gerald Whitfield had handled that side of the operation, creating a complex web of LLCs and trusts to hide their ownership. What struck me most was how preventable it all had been. If the HOA board had been properly staffed with independent members, instead of Barbara's relatives and friends, someone would have noticed the financial irregularities. If homeowners had been more organized and compared notes earlier, the patterns of abuse would have become obvious. If anyone had seriously challenged Barbara's authority sooner, the whole scheme might have collapsed years earlier. But fear and apathy are powerful forces. People get tired of fighting. They have jobs and families and their own problems. It is easier to just pay the fine, or move away, or accept the unfair denial rather than mount a serious challenge. Barbara had counted on that, and for years it had worked. The catalyst for change had been nothing more than my stubborn refusal to accept a rejection letter that made no logical sense. I had the time, the resources, and the personality to push back. And once I started pushing, other people found the courage to join in. Patricia told me during one of our follow-up meetings that the case had already influenced how HOAs operated across Nevada. The Attorney General's office had issued new guidance on HOA governance, emphasizing transparency, proper board elections, and limits on enforcement authority. Several other investigations had been opened into HOAs with similar patterns of abuse. You have no idea how many homeowners have suffered in silence from this kind of thing, she said. Your case put a spotlight on an issue that has been festering for decades. HOAs were supposed to protect property values and maintain communities. Too often, they have become tools for petty tyrants and criminals. The ripple effects continued to surprise me. A reporter from the Las Vegas Review-Journal did a feature story on the case, which got picked up by national media. I did a couple of interviews, though I tried to keep the focus on the broader issues rather than my personal story. The goal was not to make myself look heroic, but to encourage other people dealing with HOA abuse to stand up for their rights. One interview question stuck with me. The reporter asked whether I regretted buying a house in an HOA community, given everything that had happened. "Actually, no," I said after thinking about it. HOAs can serve a legitimate purpose when they are run properly. The problem is not the concept, it is the execution. We need better oversight, stronger legal protections for homeowners, and people who are willing to get involved instead of just complaining from the sidelines. My solar panels became a point of pride in the neighborhood. Several other homeowners applied for and received approval to install their own systems. Within a year, there were solar panels on about 20 houses in Riverside Meadows. The neighborhood was producing a significant amount of clean energy, exactly what I had hoped for when I first conceived the project. The environmental benefits were real, but the symbolic value was even greater. Every solar panel installation was a reminder that the community had taken back control from someone who had abused her power. They represented freedom, common sense, and the triumph of reasonable people over petty tyranny. I kept copies of all the documents from the case in a file box in my home office. Sometimes I would flip through them, remembering the anger and frustration I had felt when I first saw Barbara's rejection letter. The letter itself, with its absurd citation of satellite dish regulations to deny solar panels, had become almost funny in retrospect. It was such a perfect example of arbitrary, capricious decision-making that it had made the whole fraud scheme easier to prove. Barbara's sloppiness had been her undoing in multiple ways. If she had just made up a more plausible reason to deny my application, something vague about aesthetics or community character, it would have been much harder to challenge. By citing a completely inapplicable rule, she had provided clear evidence that her decisions were not based on any legitimate reading of the HOA's governing documents. The same pattern showed up throughout the case. Falsified meeting minutes that contradicted emails. Inflated invoices that were easily compared to market rates. Property purchases through shell companies that left obvious paper trails. Barbara had thought she was untouchable, and that arrogance had made her careless. Gerald Whitfield, in contrast, had tried to be more careful with the financial side of the scheme. But he had made his own mistakes, primarily in getting too greedy. If they had skimmed smaller amounts and paid market rates for the services from Whitfield Property Services, they might have gotten away with it indefinitely. Instead, they had stolen millions and left evidence that any competent forensic accountant could find. I thought sometimes about what motivated people like Barbara. Was it just greed? Did she get some psychological satisfaction from controlling people? Did she genuinely believe she was acting in the neighborhood's best interests, even as she stole money and destroyed people's lives? I would never know for sure, because Barbara never showed any remorse or provided any real explanation for her actions. At her sentencing hearing, she had made a brief statement claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy by lazy homeowners who wanted to let the neighborhood go to hell. Even then, even after being convicted on 15 counts and facing years in prison, she could not admit that she had done anything wrong. That inability to accept responsibility was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole saga. Barbara had hurt dozens of families, stolen millions of dollars, and corrupted an institution that was supposed to serve the community. And she still saw herself as the victim. Gerald, at least, had offered a brief apology at his sentencing. He said he had gotten caught up in Barbara's schemes and made terrible choices. It rang hollow, but it was something. He got a slightly shorter sentence, partly because of the apology and partly because he had been less directly involved in the HOA's day-to-day operations. The insurance settlement money came through about 18 months after I first filed my solar panel application. Each member of the class action received their distribution, which helped ease the financial pain that Barbara's fines and schemes had caused. It was not enough to fully compensate people for years of stress and abuse, but it was meaningful. The Riverside Meadows HOA also received a substantial payment that went into the reserve fund. Mike and the new board used some of it to hire a professional management company to handle the day-to-day operations and financial management. They chose a firm with a solid reputation and strong oversight protocols, the exact opposite of the way Barbara had run things. The neighborhood started winning awards. A local magazine named Riverside Meadows one of the best-managed HOA communities in Henderson. The turnaround story, from corrupt fiefdom to model community, attracted positive attention and helped property values continue to recover. I was happy with how things had turned out, but I also remained cautious. The new board was good, but boards can change. People move away, new members get elected, and it is always possible for problems to creep back in. The key was eternal vigilance, something the neighborhood had learned the hard way. We established new traditions to keep residents engaged. Quarterly town halls where anyone could raise concerns. An anonymous suggestion box that was actually reviewed. A neighborhood newsletter that included detailed financial reports and meeting minutes. Transparency and communication, the things that had been completely absent under Barbara's rule. My own life had settled into a comfortable routine. Work was going well. My solar panels were performing even better than projected. I had made real friends in the neighborhood, people I could count on and who could count on me. The house that had seemed like such a risky purchase during the HOA nightmare now felt like a solid, permanent home. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 years after the whole saga began, I was in my front yard doing some gardening when a car pulled up. A young couple got out and walked over. "Are you Ethan Ingram?" the man asked. "That is me," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my hands. "We are thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood," the woman said. "We heard about what happened with the HOA, and we wanted to ask you about it. Is it really safe to buy here now? We do not want to end up in a nightmare situation." I invited them to sit on my porch and spent about an hour telling them the whole story. I was honest about the problems we had faced, but also clear about the changes that had been made. I showed them copies of the new bylaws, introduced them to Mike, who happened to be walking by, and even gave them Patricia's contact information in case they wanted a lawyer to review the HOA documents before buying. "The bottom line is this," I told them as they were getting ready to leave. "Every HOA has the potential for problems, but this community has learned its lesson. We have strong oversight now, engaged residents, and clear rules. And if problems do come up in the future, people here know how to fight back. That is worth something." They bought the house 2 weeks later and became the newest members of our community. I saw them at the next HOA meeting, asking good questions and getting involved. The cycle of engagement continued. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set, and my solar panels soak up the last light of the day, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had started with such a simple thing, wanting to install solar panels on my house to save money and help the environment. That simple decision had led to uncovering massive fraud, sending criminals to prison, and transforming an entire community. The lesson, if there was one, was that small acts of resistance matter. Standing up for what is right, even in seemingly minor situations, can have consequences far beyond what you imagine. If I had just accepted Barbara's ridiculous rejection letter, or given up after her first dismissive response, none of this would have happened. Barbara and Gerald would still be stealing from the neighborhood. Families like the Chens and the Richardsons would still be suffering under arbitrary fines and denials. But I had pushed back, and that had made all the difference. The legal protections that allowed me to fight back were important too. Nevada's laws protecting solar panel installations had given me a clear legal foundation for my challenge. Federal fair housing laws had provided grounds to challenge the wheelchair ramp denial. State statutes requiring HOA transparency and proper governance had exposed the financial fraud. The law was not perfect, but it provided tools for people willing to use them. I thought about Barbara sometimes, sitting in federal prison. Did she understand what she had done? Did she feel any remorse? Or was she still convinced she had been right, that she had been the defender of standards in a neighborhood full of lazy people who did not appreciate her efforts? I would never know, and ultimately it did not matter. Justice had been served. The neighborhood had healed. Life went on. My solar panels continued to hum quietly on the roof, day after day, year after year. They were just panels of silicon and metal, converting photons into electrons, but to me they represented something more. They were a symbol of the fight for common sense, for justice, for the simple right to make reasonable decisions about my own property without interference from petty tyrants. And every month, when my tiny electric bill arrived, I smiled and thought about Barbara's rejection letter citing satellite dish regulations. It had been the stupidest mistake she could have made, and it had brought down her entire criminal empire. Sometimes the smallest things have the biggest consequences. A rejection letter, a stubborn homeowner, a lawyer willing to dig deeper, a community willing to stand together. Those were the ingredients that had changed everything. The story of Riverside Meadows became part of local lore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions made me out to be some kind of crusading hero, which was embarrassing and inaccurate. Others focused on the legal maneuvering and financial details. The truth was simpler and more human than any of the embellished versions. I was just a guy who wanted solar panels and refused to accept a nonsensical rejection. Everything else flowed from that one decision. As the years passed and life in Riverside Meadows continued peacefully under proper management, the whole saga began to feel almost dreamlike. Had it really been that bad? Had one person really caused that much damage? The evidence said yes, but the memory faded into something less visceral, more abstract. But then I would see the Chens working in their garden, healthy and happy now that the stress of endless fines was gone. Or I would watch Emma Richardson's father navigate the ramp into their house, maintaining his independence and dignity. Or I would check my solar panel production app and see the clean energy flowing from my roof into the grid. And I would remember that it had all been real, and that standing up to abuse and corruption had mattered, and that ordinary people really could make a difference when they refused to accept injustice. The sun set on another day in Henderson, Nevada. The solar panels on my roof and my neighbors' roofs absorbed the last photons of daylight. Inside houses throughout Riverside Meadows, people lived their lives free from the fear of arbitrary fines and capricious denials. It was a simple thing, really. A neighborhood where the rules made sense and were fairly applied. A community where people had a voice. An HOA that served its members instead of ruling over them. But simple things are often the most important. And sometimes, achieving them requires someone to look at a ridiculous rejection letter citing satellite dish regulations to deny solar panels and say, "No, this is wrong, and I am going to fight it." I had been that someone, almost by accident. And in fighting my small battle over solar panels, I had helped free an entire community from years of corruption and abuse. As I locked up my house for the night and turned off the lights, I felt at peace. The fight had been worth it. The neighborhood was better. Justice had been served. And my solar panels would be there in the morning, ready to catch the first rays of sunlight and convert them into clean, renewable energy. Sometimes that is all you can ask for. A wrong made right, a community made whole, and the simple satisfaction of knowing you stood up when it mattered. The story had come full circle, from a denial letter to criminal convictions to a thriving neighborhood. And at the center of it all was a simple truth. Rules should make sense, authority should be exercised fairly, and people have the right and the responsibility to fight back against those who abuse power. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the legal victories or the media attention, or even the financial settlements. What mattered was that we had proven ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. We had taken back our community from someone who had treated it as her personal kingdom. And we had built something better in its place. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about all the homeowners across the country dealing with abusive HOAs. I hoped our story would give them courage. I hoped they would see that fighting back was possible, that legal protections existed, that they were not alone. Because in the end, that was the real lesson of Riverside Meadows. When people stand together, when they refuse to accept abuse, when they use the law to defend their rights, they can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. All it takes is one person willing to look at a ridiculous rejection letter and say, "No, this is wrong." I had been that person. And it had changed everything.